Sometimes when life pushes you to the edge, you discover strength you never knew existed. Sometimes the place everyone else fears becomes the sanctuary you desperately need. A ruined mansion in rural Pennsylvania had sat empty for 40 years. The county offered it free, but no one wanted it. The roof leaked, the floors sagged, and locals called it cursed. 3 owners had died there, and strange lights appeared in the windows at night. Then Irene Sullivan arrived, 7 months pregnant and alone. She had nothing but a suitcase and nowhere else to go. While others saw a nightmare, she saw possibility. She signed the deed that same day. The townspeople thought she had lost her mind. They had no idea that this broken-down mansion would change her life forever. What she found hidden in those crumbling walls would shock everyone. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Irene Sullivan had learned that life could change in an instant. 3 months ago, she'd been Mrs. David Sullivan, living in a tidy suburban apartment with a husband who came home every evening at 6:30 sharp. She'd been planning a nursery, in soft yellows and greens, debating between organic cotton sheets and bamboo fiber blankets. The future had seemed as predictable as sunrise. Then she found the credit card statements hidden in David's desk drawer. Vegas, Atlantic City, online poker sites. Their savings account had been emptied months ago, the second mortgage he'd taken on their condo without telling her. The baby wasn't due for 3 months, and they were broke. The divorce papers were signed on a Tuesday. By Friday, she was homeless. Now, standing before the Whitmore estate with her grandmother's locket hanging heavy against her chest, Irene felt the October wind cut through her thin coat. The mansion loomed before her like something from a Gothic novel. 3 stories of weathered Victorian architecture, complete with a wraparound porch that sagged at one corner, and windows that stared down at her like empty eyes. The realtor had fled after handing her the keys. "Good luck," he'd mumbled, practically running to his car. She couldn't blame him. Even in daylight, the place felt haunted. But haunted was better than homeless. Millbrook, Pennsylvania, population 847 according to the welcome sign, wasn't exactly a thriving metropolis. Main Street consisted of a hardware store, a diner, a small grocery, and a library that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Eisenhower administration. The kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were noticed immediately. Irene had definitely been noticed. "You're the one who took the Whitmore place," said the elderly Asian woman who approached as Irene struggled with her suitcase on the mansion's front steps. The woman moved with the careful precision of someone in her 80s, but her eyes were sharp and kind. "I'm Helen Chen. I live next door." She gestured to a neat white house that sat about a quarter-mile down the gravel road. "Irene Sullivan," she replied, grateful for a friendly face. "And yes, I guess I am the crazy person who signed the deed." Mrs. Chen studied her with the frank assessment of someone who'd seen enough of life to recognize genuine desperation. 7 months along? 7.5. Irene unconsciously placed her hand on her swollen belly. "Due in December. Winter baby." Mrs. Chen nodded approvingly. "Resilient creatures, winter babies. You'll need that here." She glanced up at the mansion's imposing facade. "This place has been empty since I was a girl. My grandfather used to work for the Whitmores back in the day." "What happened to them?" Mrs. Chen's expression grew distant. "They just disappeared. One day they were here, the next they were gone. Left everything behind. People say it's cursed, but I think some places just hold their secrets close." The front door opened with a groan that seemed to echo from the mansion's very bones. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of afternoon sunlight that slanted through grimy windows. The entry hall stretched before them, its hardwood floors scarred but still beautiful beneath decades of neglect. A grand staircase curved up to the second floor, its banister carved with intricate woodwork that spoke of craftsmen who took pride in their art. "The electricity was turned on yesterday," Mrs. Chen said, flipping a switch. A crystal chandelier flickered to life overhead, several bulbs missing but still magnificent. Frank Morrison from the hardware store got it working. He's a good man. Lost. His wife 2 years ago keeps busy helping folks around town. Irene wandered deeper into the house, her footsteps echoing in the vast space. The parlor held ghostly outlines where furniture had once stood, rectangles of unfaded wallpaper marking where pictures had hung. But beneath the dust and abandonment, she could see the mansion's bones, the soaring ceilings, the detailed moldings, the way the rooms flowed one into another with the gracious logic of a bygone era. "It's beautiful," she whispered, surprising herself. It was, Mrs. Chen agreed. The Whitmores spared no expense. Thomas Whitmore was. Unusual, brilliant, but unusual. Always tinkering with things, building contraptions in the basement. My grandfather said he could make electricity dance. They explored the first floor together. A library with built-in shelves that reached the ceiling, a kitchen that would need complete renovation, a formal dining room with a fireplace large enough to stand in. Each room told a story of lives, interrupted, of a family that had simply vanished one day, leaving behind only questions. In the library, Irene paused before a collection of dusty portraits still hanging on the wall. The largest showed a man in his 50s with intelligent eyes and a strong jawline. Something about his face seemed familiar, though she couldn't place why. "That's Thomas Whitmore," Mrs. Chen said softly. "Built this place in 1882. He was an inventor, patents, electrical things that were far ahead of their time. People said he was a genius. What happened to him? Disappeared in 1943. Him, his wife, their grown son. Left for a trip to Pittsburgh and never came back. Police found their car abandoned on the side of the road, but no bodies, no explanation. Just gone. That night, alone in the mansion with only a sleeping bag and a battery-powered lantern for company, Irene lay in what had once been the master bedroom and listened to the house settle around her. Old houses made noise, she knew that intellectually. Boards expanding and contracting, pipes ticking as they cooled, wind finding its way through gaps in the walls. But the Whitmore estate seemed to whisper. She pressed her hand to her belly, feeling the baby shift and turn. "It's just us now, little one," she murmured. "Just us in this big old house. We're going to be fine." The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows. Somewhere in the walls, something creaked, a sound like footsteps, but not quite. Irene pulled the sleeping bag tighter around her shoulders and closed her eyes. Tomorrow, she would start making this place livable. She had $43 in her checking account, no job, and a baby coming in 10 weeks. But she also had something she'd never had before. A home that was truly hers, no matter how broken it might be. In her dreams, she walked through the mansion as it had once been, with warm light spilling from every window and the sound of laughter echoing through the halls. A tall man with kind eyes stood at the foot of the grand staircase, watching her, with an expression of infinite patience, as if he'd been waiting for her to arrive. When she woke to grey morning light, Irene touched her grandmother's locket and felt, for the first time in months, something that might have been hope. The morning brought practical concerns that couldn't be ignored by dreams or hope. Irene woke to frost on the windows and her breath visible in the chilly air. The mansion's heating system, if it had ever worked, certainly didn't now. She spent her first week focused on survival. Frank Morrison arrived on Tuesday with a truck full of supplies and the kind of steady competence that comes from decades of fixing things that are broken. He was a man in his late 60s with calloused hands and eyes that had seen enough sorrow to recognize it in others. "Furnace is shot," he announced after an hour in the basement. "But we can get a space heater going in one room. Make it livable until spring." He paused at the kitchen door, taking in her obviously pregnant state and the single suitcase that contained all her worldly possessions. "You planning to stay through winter?" "I'm planning to stay, period," Irene said with more conviction than she felt. Frank nodded as if this made perfect sense. "Then we better get to work." The library became her base camp. It had southern exposure for maximum warmth, built-in shelves for storage, and a fireplace that Frank declared probably safe to use with caution. More importantly, it felt like the heart of the house, a place where someone had once spent long, comfortable hours surrounded by books and ideas. It was while cleaning the library's windows that Irene noticed the wallpaper behind Thomas Whitmore's portrait seemed to bulge slightly. When she pressed against it, a section of the ornate Victorian pattern shifted, revealing a loose edge. Carefully, she peeled back the paper. Behind it, tucked into a small cavity in the wall, was a brass key. The key was old, but beautifully crafted, with an intricate pattern etched into its bow. It didn't match any of the locks she'd found throughout the mansion. She'd checked them all during her first week, more out of curiosity than any real purpose. Mrs. Chen arrived that afternoon with a casserole dish and raised eyebrows at Irene's discovery. "My grandfather mentioned that Mr. Whitmore was secretive," she said, turning the key over in her weathered hands. "Always locking things away," he said. "That man has more secrets than a confessional." But what would it unlock? "Let me tell you what I remember." Mrs. Chen settled into the one chair Frank had brought from town. "Thomas Whitmore wasn't just an inventor. He was paranoid, especially toward the end, before they disappeared. My grandfather said he was convinced someone was trying to steal his work. He started hiding things, became suspicious of visitors, stopped going to town except when absolutely necessary. They spent the afternoon searching. Every door, every drawer, every cabinet in the mansion. The key didn't fit anything obvious. It was only when Irene was kneeling before the library fireplace, trying to determine if the flue was open, that she noticed something odd about the stonework. One stone, about 3 feet up on the right side of the fireplace opening, seemed slightly different from the others. When she pressed against it, it shifted inward with a soft click. Behind the stone was a keyhole. The brass key fit perfectly, with a grinding sound that spoke of decades of disuse. A section of the fireplace's back wall swung inward, revealing a narrow passage that disappeared into darkness. "My word," Mrs. Chen breathed. Irene grabbed her flashlight with hands that trembled slightly. The passage was just wide enough for one person, with stone walls that felt cold and slightly damp. It angled downward for about 10 feet before opening into a hidden room. The space was small but furnished. A desk, a chair, filing cabinets, and walls lined with shelves. Everything was covered in dust, but preserved in the dry air like artifacts in a tomb. On the desk sat an oil lamp, a fountain pen, and an open leather journal. And on the wall, staring down at them with familiar, intelligent eyes, was another portrait of Thomas Whitmore. But this one was different, painted later in his life, she guessed, because his face showed the lines of worry that weren't present in the library portrait. Irene approached the desk with the reverence of an archaeologist entering a pharaoh's tomb. The journal was open to an entry dated March 15th, 1943. "They know," she read aloud. "I'm certain of it now. The men who came by yesterday weren't from the patent office. Their questions were too specific, too focused on applications I never filed publicly. Someone has been watching, waiting. I should have been more careful." Mrs. Chen moved to stand beside her, reading over her shoulder. "What men? What was he talking about?" Irene turned the page. The handwriting became more hurried, urgent. April 2nd, 1943. "Margaret thinks I'm becoming paranoid, but I know what I saw in Pittsburgh. The same men from the patent office meeting, but they weren't supposed to be there. They were watching our hotel. I've decided to move the important papers here to the room. If something happens to us, perhaps someday someone will find them and understand what we were trying to accomplish." The family disappeared in April 1943, Mrs. Chen said quietly. Irene flipped through more pages, her heart racing. Entry after entry detailed Thomas's growing fears, his conviction that powerful interests were conspiring to steal his life's work. He wrote about a revolutionary electrical system, patents that would reshape how power was distributed across the country, technology that was decades ahead of its time. Listen to this. Irene found an entry from April 10th. I've hidden everything here, in the room Margaret doesn't know about. The complete designs, the proofs, even the correspondence with the government officials who seemed so interested in my work. If I'm right about what's coming, this may be the only record that survives. The final entry was dated April 15th, 1943. We leave for Pittsburgh tomorrow morning. Margaret has family there, and I've told her we need to visit. But I know we're not coming back. I can feel it. If anyone finds this room, know that what I built could change the world. I only pray that someday, someone will have the courage to finish what I started. Irene closed the journal, her hands shaking. The hidden room suddenly felt smaller, the air thicker. She looked at the portrait of Thomas Whitmore, and for a moment, his painted eyes seemed to be looking directly at her. "Mrs. Chen," she said slowly, "I think I understand why no one wanted this house." "What do you mean?" "I don't think the Whitmores just disappeared." Irene gestured to the journal, the hidden room, the obvious signs of a man preparing for the worst. "I think someone killed them for whatever Thomas was working on." The older woman was quiet for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. "My grandfather always said something felt wrong about how they just vanished. No goodbyes, no forwarding address. And their car was found empty, but their luggage was still in the hotel room in Pittsburgh." Irene felt the baby kick, as if responding to her elevated heart rate. She placed both hands on her belly, suddenly aware that she was alone in this big house, with secrets that had already cost one family their lives. "What do you think we should do?" she asked. Mrs. Chen looked around the hidden room, taking in the filing cabinets, the shelves of documents, the decades of dust that had kept Thomas Whitmore's secrets safe. "I think," she said carefully, "that we should find out exactly what Thomas Whitmore invented that was worth killing for." The next few days blurred together in a haze of discovery and growing unease. Irene spent every daylight hour in Thomas's hidden room, carefully examining the documents he'd left behind. Mrs. Chen brought meals and stayed to help decipher the technical drawings and correspondence that painted an increasingly disturbing picture of corporate greed and conspiracy. Thomas Whitmore's journal revealed a brilliant mind consumed by a single revolutionary idea, a power distribution system that could transmit electricity over vast distances with minimal loss. His designs showed a network of specialized transformers and conductors that would make centralized power generation practical on a scale never before imagined. "Look at this entry from 1941. Irene read aloud, her finger tracing the faded ink. "The gentlemen from Edison Electric were very interested in my preliminary findings." Too interested. They asked questions about aspects of the design I hadn't shared publicly, suggesting they have sources I'm not aware of. "I've decided to be more circumspect about my research going forward." Mrs. Chen looked up from a stack of technical drawings. "Edison Electric. That company was bought out by Con Ed decades ago. They're still one of the biggest power companies in the Northeast." The filing cabinets yielded even more troubling discoveries. Correspondence with government officials who promised support but asked increasingly pointed questions about commercial applications. Patent office documents that showed unusual interest in Thomas's preliminary filings. Letters from investors who wanted to partner but insisted on complete access to his research. What became clear was that Thomas Whitmore had invented something that could revolutionize the electrical industry, and powerful people wanted to control it. "This is his masterwork," Irene said, spreading out a series of blueprints across the desk. The drawings showed a complex system of interconnected components, with mathematical calculations covering every margin. He called it the Whitmore grid. According to his notes, it could reduce transmission losses by 80% and make power distribution profitable across hundreds of miles. What does that mean in practical terms? It means rural areas could have the same reliable electricity as cities. It means one power plant could serve 10 times the area it does now. It means, Irene paused as the implications sank in. It means the entire electrical industry would have to be rebuilt from the ground up. Mrs. Chen set down the papers she'd been reading. No wonder they wanted to steal it. But the most disturbing discovery came when Irene found Thomas's correspondence with his patent attorney. The lawyer had been pressuring him to file his applications quickly, claiming there were rumors of competing research. Yet the letters showed the attorney was also in contact with several of the same companies that had been pressuring Thomas for access to his work. His own lawyer was working against him, Irene realized. Thomas figured it out too. Look at this. She pointed to a journal entry from February 1943. I no longer trust Morrison. Yes, even his name suggests he may be connected to the Morrison electrical family. His insistence that I rush the patent applications feels increasingly suspicious. I've decided to complete my work in secret and file everything myself, directly with the patent office. Morrison, Mrs. Chen repeated slowly. Frank Morrison? Different Morrison, surely. Frank's family has been in Millbrook for generations. He told me his grandfather ran the hardware store before him, but doubt had been planted. That afternoon, when Frank arrived to install better insulation in the library, Irene found herself studying him with new eyes. He was competent, helpful, and seemed genuinely concerned about her welfare. But she also noticed how easily he moved through the mansion, how familiar he seemed with its layout despite claiming he'd never been inside before she arrived. Frank, she said carefully as he worked on the windows. Mrs. Chen mentioned that Thomas Whitmore's patent attorney was named Morrison. Any relation? Frank paused in his work, his hands stilling on the window frame. Morrison's a common name around here, he said without turning around. Could be coincidence. Could be. But when he left that evening, Irene noticed he drove past the turn that should have taken him back to town, continuing instead down the old farm road that led deeper into the countryside. Her pregnancy had reached the point where sleep came in uncomfortable fragments. That night, lying in her sleeping bag in the library, she felt the baby's restless movements matching her own unease. The heating unit Frank had installed hummed quietly, but even its warmth couldn't chase away the chill that had settled in her bones. Around midnight, she heard it again, the sound that had become familiar over the past week. Footsteps in the walls, or something that sounded like footsteps. Old houses settled, she knew that. But these sounds seemed too regular, too purposeful to be mere structural shifting. She grabbed her flashlight and followed the sound, moving as quietly as her pregnant body would allow. The noise seemed to come from the area behind the kitchen, in what had once been the servants' quarters. When she reached the back hallway, the sounds stopped, but she could smell something that hadn't been there before. Fresh air, as if a window had been opened somewhere in the house. A systematic check revealed that all the windows and doors were still locked from the inside. But in the basement, near the old furnace room, she found something that made her blood run cold. Fresh footprints in the dust. Boot prints, size 11 or 12, leading from the basement's exterior entrance to the area directly below. Thomas's hidden room. Someone had been in the house while she slept. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Dr. Sarah Martinez arrived in response to Mrs. Chen's suggestion that Irene needed prenatal care. She was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and the sort of competent manner that inspired immediate confidence. You're about 32 weeks along, Dr. Martinez said after her examination. Everything looks good, but I'm concerned about your stress levels. Your blood pressure is elevated, and Mrs. Chen tells me you've been under some strain. You could say that. Dr. Martinez packed her equipment with the efficiency of someone used to making house calls. I know this town can be unwelcoming to outsiders, especially someone in your situation. If you need someone to talk to, I'm a good listener. Something in her tone suggested she was offering more than medical advice. Irene made a decision that would prove crucial in the days to come. Dr. Martinez, what do you know about the Whitmore family? I know they disappeared under mysterious circumstances 80 years ago. I also know that several people have tried to buy this property over the years, always offering significantly more than it's worth for a house in this condition. Dr. Martinez paused. And I know that Frank Morrison's great-uncle was Thomas Whitmore's patent attorney. Irene felt her heart skip. You know about that? Small towns have long memories. My family has been here for 3 generations. My grandmother used to clean for the Whitmores before they disappeared. She always said something felt wrong about how quickly everyone wanted to forget what happened to them. What else did your grandmother tell you? Dr. Martinez glanced toward the library, as if she could see through the walls to the hidden room beyond. She said Thomas Whitmore was working on something that would have made him the richest man in Pennsylvania. And she said the night before the family left for Pittsburgh, she saw men watching the house from the tree line. Men in suits, men with guns. Dr. Martinez's revelation about armed men watching the Whitmore house 80 years ago cast every shadow in a sinister light. But it was her offer to help research Thomas's patents that proved most valuable. She had connections at the state university where her brother taught law, and within days, she'd provided Irene with information that changed everything. According to the patent database, Dr. Martinez explained, spreading documents across the library table, Thomas Whitmore filed 17 preliminary patents between 1940 and 1943, but only 3 were ever officially processed. And those were for minor improvements to existing transformer designs. What happened to the others? They disappeared from the system. No record of rejection, no record of approval, just gone. But here's what's interesting. She pulled out a thick folder. My brother found references to Whitmore's work in several major patents filed between 1945 and 1950. Different inventors, different companies, but the core technologies are identical to what Thomas described in his journal. Irene studied the documents with growing amazement and rage. Companies that had been pressuring Thomas for access to his research had somehow filed patents for nearly identical systems just 2 years after his disappearance. The Whitmore grid, the revolutionary power distribution system that could have made Thomas wealthy beyond measure, had been carved up and distributed among the very corporations he'd been trying to protect his work from. They stole everything, she whispered. It gets worse, Dr. Martinez continued. The current value of those patents and the licensing fees they've generated over the past 70 years is estimated in the hundreds of millions of dollars. The baby kicked hard, as if responding to Irene's surge of adrenaline. She placed both hands on her belly, feeling the weight of injustice settling over her like a heavy cloak. Somewhere in this legal maze was proof that Thomas Whitmore had been robbed not just of his life, but of a legacy that should have provided for generations of his family, a legacy that, by rights, belonged to her. Dr. Martinez, is there any way to prove that Thomas was the original inventor? If you had his complete files, his original drawings and calculations possibly. Patent law allows for the restoration of rights under certain circumstances, especially when fraud can be proven. She paused. Do you have access to Thomas's complete records? Irene gestured toward the fireplace. More than you might think. They spent the next several hours cataloging the contents of Thomas's hidden room. The filing cabinets yielded treasure troves of evidence, original calculations in Thomas's handwriting, dated photographs of prototype equipment, correspondence showing the timeline of his discoveries. Most importantly, they found what Thomas had called his insurance policy, copies of letters from the patent attorney who had been working against him, detailing how Thomas's applications were being delayed while competing filings were rushed through the system. This is extraordinary, Dr. Martinez breathed. Examining a letter dated March 1943, this attorney is essentially confessing to patent fraud in writing. He's telling his contacts at Edison Electric exactly which aspects of Thomas's design to focus on for their own applications. But can any of this be used legally? I mean, it's been 80 years. My brother would need to research that, but there are precedents for restoring patents when fraud can be proven regardless of time elapsed. Especially when the original inventor died under suspicious circumstances. The mention of Thomas's death brought them back to more immediate concerns. Someone knew about the hidden room. The fresh footprints in the basement proved that. And if Thomas's fears had been justified 80 years ago, it stood to reason that the same interests might still be at work. "Have you told anyone else about what you found?" Dr. Martinez asked. "Only Mrs. Chen, and Frank knows I found something, though I haven't told him what." "Frank Morrison." Dr. Martinez's expression grew troubled. "Irene, I need to tell you something about Frank. His great-uncle wasn't just Thomas's patent attorney. He was the one who handled the Whitmore estate after the family disappeared. He's the reason the property ended up in county hands instead of going to Thomas's relatives." "What relatives?" "Thomas had a son who survived the trip to Pittsburgh. He was in the army, stationed overseas when his parents disappeared. When he came back after the war, he tried to claim his inheritance. But the attorney had already declared the estate abandoned and transferred ownership to the county for unpaid taxes." Irene felt the blood drain from her face. "What happened to the son?" "He gave up fighting the legal system and moved to California. Changed his name, started over. But he had children. Dr. Martinez." Irene's voice came out as barely a whisper. "What was the son's name?" "Robert Whitmore. But after he moved west, he went by Robert Sullivan." The library seemed to tilt around Irene. She gripped the edge of the table, her knees suddenly weak. "Sullivan? My brother found the records. Robert Sullivan settled in Sacramento, married a woman named Dorothy Chen. Yes, Mrs. Chen's great-niece, which is how I knew to look for the connection. They had 2 children. One of them was named James Sullivan, Irene's father's name. The father she'd barely known, who died in a car accident when she was 12. The man whose family history had always been vague, filled with stories about how his father had lost everything in the war and started over with nothing. Irene, if I'm right about the family connections, you're not just some random person who happened to buy this house. You're Thomas Whitmore's great-granddaughter. You're the rightful heir to everything that was stolen from your family." The revelation hit her like a physical blow. She sank into the chair behind Thomas's desk, staring at the portrait on the wall with new understanding. The familiar features she'd noticed, they were her own features. The strong jawline and intelligent eyes that people had always said she'd inherited from her father's side. That's why Mrs. Chen was so willing to help, she realized. She knew. "I suspect she's known since the day you arrived. The Chen family has been keeping watch over this house for 80 years, waiting for a Whitmore to come home." The baby kicked again, more gently this time, as if settling into the knowledge that they were exactly where they belonged. Irene touched her grandmother's locket, remembering now why the old woman had always spoken about family obligations and debts that must be paid. Her grandmother had been Dorothy Chen Sullivan, Mrs. Chen's great-niece. "So what do we do now?" she asked. "Now we prove that Thomas Whitmore was murdered for his inventions, and we get you back what your family was owed. But first," Dr. Martinez's expression grew serious, "we need to figure out who's been watching you, and whether they know what you've discovered." As if summoned by her words, the sound of a truck pulling up the driveway reached them through the library windows. Frank Morrison had arrived for his daily check on the house repairs, and this time he wasn't alone. Through the library window, Irene watched Frank Morrison climb down from his truck, followed by 2 men in dark suits who moved with the purposeful stride of people accustomed to getting what they wanted. One was tall and thin, with prematurely grey hair, the other shorter but built like a linebacker. Neither looked like they were there to discuss hardware supplies. "Dr. Martinez," Irene whispered urgently, "is there another way out of this room?" "Not that I can see, but there's no reason they should know about the hidden passage." Dr. Martinez quickly began gathering the most important documents. "Can you seal the entrance from inside?" "I think so." Irene's hands shook as she stuffed Thomas's journal and the patent correspondence into a bag. "But what if they search the house? Then we pray your great-grandfather was as clever about hiding things as his journal suggests." The sound of the front door opening echoed through the mansion. Frank's voice carried clearly in the crisp morning air, along with 2 unfamiliar voices that spoke with the flat authority of men used to being obeyed. Irene and Dr. Martinez quickly moved through the hidden passage back to the library. The fireplace entrance closed with barely a whisper, leaving no visible trace of the secret room beyond. They had just enough time to arrange themselves casually around the library table before footsteps approached down the hall. "Irene?" Frank's voice carried a note of tension she'd never heard before. "You have visitors?" The two men who entered the library studied the room with eyes that missed nothing. The tall one introduced himself as James Fletcher from the County Development Office, while his companion remained silent and watchful. "Ms. Sullivan," Fletcher said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, "I understand you've been exploring your new property quite thoroughly." "Just trying to make it livable," Irene replied, proud that her voice remained steady. "It's a big house, indeed it is. The county has been interested in this property for some time. We've had several inquiries from developers who believe it could be quite valuable with the right improvements." Dr. Martinez stepped forward with the protective instincts of someone used to dealing with bureaucrats. "I'm Dr. Martinez, Ms. Sullivan's physician. She's in her third trimester and needs to avoid unnecessary stress." Fletcher's companion spoke for the first time, his voice carrying a slight accent that might have been East Coast old money. "Of course. We're simply here to make Ms. Sullivan aware of her options. The county is prepared to make a very generous offer for the property, significantly more than its assessed value." "How generous?" Irene asked, curious despite herself. $50,000, Fletcher said. "Cash with a 30-day escrow." Irene felt her breath catch. $50,000 would solve every problem she faced: medical bills, childcare, a fresh start somewhere safe. It was more money than she'd ever imagined having. Enough to set up a comfortable life for her and the baby. It was also far too much money for a house that had been given away for free just weeks earlier. "That's very generous," she said carefully. "But I just moved in. I haven't really had time to consider selling." "Of course," Fletcher's smile became slightly more forced. "But winter is coming, and this house isn't exactly suitable for a woman in your condition. Heating costs alone will be substantial, and the nearest hospital is over an hour away." "Ms. Sullivan has adequate medical care," Dr. Martinez interjected. "And the house is becoming quite comfortable with the improvements Mr. Morrison has been making." Frank had remained unusually quiet during this exchange, standing near the door with an expression Irene couldn't read. When she looked at him questioningly, he gave an almost imperceptible shake of his head. "Perhaps you could give us some time to think about it," Irene suggested. The silent man finally spoke again. "Of course. But I should mention that this is a limited-time offer. Development opportunities in this area are time-sensitive. After they left, the library felt somehow smaller, as if their presence had consumed all the available oxygen." Frank remained behind, checking the window locks with unnecessary attention to detail. "Frank," Irene said quietly, "what was that really about?" He turned from the window, his weathered face showing an expression of profound regret. "Irene, there are things about my family that I should have told you sooner. Things that might put you in danger, such as, my great-uncle was Thomas Whitmore's attorney, the one who betrayed him." Frank's voice was heavy with shame. "I've known about the corruption in this town my whole life, known that powerful people have been covering up what happened to the Whitmores. I came here to help you because I hoped I could make up for what my family did." Dr. Martinez leaned forward. "Frank, how much do you know about what Thomas was working on?" "More than I should. My great-uncle kept files, insurance he called them, evidence of what really happened, who was involved, how the patents were stolen. When he died, my grandfather inherited those files, and when my grandfather died, they came to me." "You have evidence?" Irene's heart began to race. "Boxes of it. Letters, financial records, even photographs of the men who killed the Whitmores. My family has been sitting on proof of murder and conspiracy for 80 years. Why didn't you ever come forward?" Frank's laugh was bitter. "Come forward to who?" "The sheriff, whose grandfather was one of the men involved. The mayor, whose family has been taking money from development companies for decades. This town has been bought and paid for since before I was born." Dr. Martinez stood up, her medical training kicking in as she began to pace. "Frank, if you have evidence, we need to see it. And we need to get Irene somewhere safe while we figure out what to do with it. Safe from what? Irene demanded. I need to understand what we're dealing with. Frank moved to the window, peering out at the empty driveway. The men who were just here. Fletcher isn't from any county development office. He's a lawyer who works for a consortium of electrical companies. Companies that have been making billions of dollars from patents that were stolen from your great-grandfather. They know who I am? They know you're Thomas Whitmore's descendant, and they know you've been exploring the house. What they don't know yet is whether you found anything that could threaten them. Dr. Martinez stopped pacing. But the offer to buy the house suggests they're worried. $50,000 is a lot of money to spend on a property that was worthless until Irene arrived. It's not about the money, Frank said grimly. It's about control. As long as this house remains empty and forgotten, the secrets stay buried. But if someone starts asking the right questions, digging into the right documents, they'll do what they did to Thomas and his family. Irene finished. The baby kicked hard, as if protesting the danger that surrounded them. Irene placed her hands on her belly, feeling the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. She was carrying not just her own child, but the last hope for justice for a family that had been murdered for their brilliance and integrity. Frank, she said quietly, I need to see those files your family kept. All of them. Irene, if we do this, there's no going back. Once you know everything, you'll be as much of a threat to them as Thomas was. She looked around the library, at the portrait of Thomas Whitmore watching over them with patient eyes. At the fireplace that concealed his hidden room and life's work, at the home that had waited 80 years for a Whitmore to return. Then, I guess it's time to finish what my great-grandfather started. That evening, Frank returned with a pickup truck loaded with boxes that represented 80 years of family guilt. The Morrison family had kept meticulous records of their complicity in the Whitmore murders, creating an archive that was both damning evidence and insurance policy. My great-uncle was thorough, Frank explained as they carried the boxes into the library. Kept copies of everything, correspondence with the corporations, payments received for information, even photographs from the night the Whitmores were killed. Dr. Martinez opened the first box and immediately recoiled. Frank, these are crime scene photographs. Irene forced herself to look. The images showed 3 bodies in a wooded area, clearly arranged to look like a car accident. But the wounds were wrong. Thomas Whitmore had been shot in the back of the head, execution style. His wife and son had met similar fates. The official report said they died in a car crash, Frank said quietly. But the car was found miles away from the bodies, and there was no blood in the vehicle. My great-uncle documented everything because he was afraid he'd be next. Who ordered the killings? A consortium of electrical companies led by Edison Electric. They called themselves the Power Alliance. Their goal was to control all major electrical patents and prevent any technology that could disrupt their monopoly from reaching the market. Dr. Martinez pulled out a folder filled with financial records. Look at this. Payment schedules, expense reports, even a budget line item labeled Whitmore Resolution. They treated murder like a business expense. The most damning evidence came in the form of letters between Power Alliance executives and government officials. The correspondence showed a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of industry and politics, with Thomas Whitmore's revolutionary power grid seen as a threat to established interests worth billions of dollars. This letter is from the Secretary of Commerce, Irene read aloud. He's telling the Power Alliance that Thomas's patents could destabilize the entire electrical industry and recommending permanent solutions to the problem. Government-sanctioned murder, Dr. Martinez whispered. But the most shocking revelation came when they found the Power Alliance's current organizational structure. The consortium had evolved over the decades, but its core mission remained the same: control emerging electrical technologies and eliminate threats to established market share. My God, Frank breathed. Studying a document from the 1990s, they're still operating. Still using the same methods. The current Power Alliance included major electrical companies, government contractors, and what appeared to be a private security firm specializing in corporate problem resolution. James Fletcher, the man who had visited that morning, was listed as their chief legal counsel. They know I found something, Irene realized. That's why they made the offer so quickly. Dr. Martinez was examining correspondence from recent years. It's worse than that. Look at this. They've been monitoring the Whitmore property for decades, waiting to see if any family members would surface. They have a file on you, Irene. They know about your pregnancy, your divorce, even your financial situation. How is that possible? Credit reports, public records, surveillance. When you applied for the deed transfer, it triggered alerts in their system. They've been watching you since the day you arrived. Frank pulled out another folder, his face grim. There's more. Other inventors over the years who developed similar technologies. All of them died in accidents or disappeared entirely. The Power Alliance has been killing innovators for 80 years. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Patents for revolutionary energy technologies had been systematically suppressed, their inventors silenced, their families threatened into compliance. Thomas Whitmore hadn't been an isolated case. He'd been one victim in an ongoing campaign of technological suppression that continued to the present day. But why? Irene asked. Why go to such lengths? Control, Dr. Martinez answered, studying financial projections from the Power Alliance files. Thomas's grid technology, if implemented, would have made the current electrical infrastructure obsolete. Companies that have invested trillions in power plants and distribution networks would lose everything. It's about more than money, Frank added. It's about power, literally and figuratively. The ability to control energy distribution is the ability to control entire economies. The Power Alliance doesn't just want profits. They want to determine which technologies see the light of day. Irene felt the baby shifting restlessly, responding to her elevated stress levels. She forced herself to breathe deeply, to think clearly despite the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Dr. Martinez, is your brother still willing to help with the legal research?
Of course.
But Irene, we're not just talking about patent restoration anymore. This is evidence of ongoing criminal conspiracy, including murder. We need to involve federal authorities. Can we trust them? Frank asked skeptically. These files show government officials at the highest levels were involved in the original conspiracy. My brother has connections with federal prosecutors who specialize in corporate crime, people who've built their careers on taking down exactly this kind of conspiracy. They spent the next several hours organizing the evidence, creating a timeline that stretched from Thomas Whitmore's murder to the present day. The pattern was clear. Anyone who threatened the Power Alliance's control over electrical technology was systematically eliminated. Look at this. Irene discovered a folder labeled Current Threats. Inside were profiles of inventors, researchers, and entrepreneurs working on energy technologies that could disrupt traditional power distribution. Several had died in recent years under suspicious circumstances. This one is dated last month. Dr. Martinez pointed to a file on a solar energy researcher who had allegedly committed suicide. And this one from 6 months ago, a wind power innovator who died in a car accident. They're still killing people, Frank said flatly. The implications were terrifying. Irene wasn't just dealing with a decades-old conspiracy. She was confronting an active criminal organization that had murdered dozens of people and wouldn't hesitate to kill. Again, we need to get you somewhere safe, Dr. Martinez said. Tonight, no. Irene's voice was stronger than she felt. If we run now, they win. Thomas's work stays buried, his killers remain free, and nothing changes. Irene, you're 8 months pregnant. This isn't the time for heroics. This is exactly the time. She gestured to the boxes of evidence surrounding them. Don't you see? They've been getting away with murder for 80 years because no one was brave enough to stand up to them. Because people like us always ran when things got dangerous. Frank studied her with new respect. What are you proposing? We take everything we've found, Thomas's original work, the Power Alliance files, all of it, and we make it public. Not just to federal prosecutors, but to the media, to engineering journals, to everyone who needs to know the truth. They'll try to stop us, then we better move fast. Irene looked around the library, at the portrait of Thomas Whitmore, at the fireplace that had hidden his life's work for 8 decades. My great-grandfather spent his last weeks preparing for exactly this moment. He left us everything we need to finish what he started. Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. My brother can contact federal prosecutors and arrange protective custody while the investigation proceeds. But you're right. We need to get the evidence into multiple hands simultaneously. I can reach out to some investigative journalists, Frank offered, people who specialize in corporate corruption stories. And I can contact engineering professors who would understand the technical significance of Thomas's work, Irene added. Once the scientific community knows what was stolen, there will be pressure to restore the patents. As they planned their strategy, the baby kicked hard, a reminder that time was running short. Irene was due in less than 6 weeks, and there was no guarantee the Power Alliance would wait that long to make their move. One more thing, Frank said, pulling out a final folder. My great-uncle left instructions. If anyone ever tried to expose the conspiracy, he wanted them to know about the insurance policy. What insurance policy? Thomas Whitmore hid copies of everything, not just in the secret room, but in other locations. Safe deposit boxes, trusted friends, even some buried on the property. My great-uncle helped him set up a network of evidence caches that were designed to surface if anything happened to him. Irene felt a surge of hope. Are those caches still intact? Some of them. My great-uncle left a map. As Frank spread out a hand-drawn diagram of the Whitmore property, Irene realized her great-grandfather had been even more thorough than she'd imagined. The evidence they'd found was just the beginning. Thomas Whitmore had created an entire conspiracy to expose the conspiracy against him. Tomorrow, she said with quiet determination, we start digging up the truth. The morning brought more than just grey November skies. It brought Mayor Richard Fletcher and 2 police officers to Irene's door, armed with a court order that made her blood run cold. Mental health evaluation, Mayor Fletcher announced with barely concealed satisfaction. Concerned citizens have reported erratic behavior, paranoid delusions, and potential danger to an unborn child. This is ridiculous, Dr. Martinez protested, reading over the legal documents. I'm Ms. Sullivan's physician, and she's perfectly stable. The court has appointed Dr. Harrison from the county mental health facility to conduct an independent evaluation, one of the officers explained. Ms. Sullivan needs to come with us voluntarily, or we'll be forced to take her into protective custody. Irene realized with sickening clarity that the Power Alliance had moved faster than they'd anticipated. Unable to buy her silence or frighten her into leaving, they were using the legal system to neutralize her. How long will this evaluation take? She asked, trying to keep her voice steady. 72 hours minimum, Mayor Fletcher replied. Longer if Dr. Harrison determines you're a danger to yourself or others. 3 days locked in a mental health facility would give the Power Alliance time to search the mansion thoroughly, confiscate or destroy the evidence, and craft a narrative that would discredit anything she might say afterward. It was a perfect solution. Who would believe the paranoid ravings of a woman who'd been declared mentally unstable? I need a few minutes to pack some things, Irene said. Mayor Fletcher checked his watch impatiently. 5 minutes. Dr. Martinez followed her into the library, ostensibly to help gather personal items. Can you stall them? Irene whispered urgently. Not for long, but Frank should be here soon with the equipment to start searching for the buried evidence caches. Tell him to work fast. And contact your brother immediately. We need federal intervention before they can bury this completely. As they spoke in hushed tones, Irene's eyes fell on Thomas Whitmore's portrait. Her great-grandfather seemed to be watching her with an expression of infinite patience, as if he'd anticipated this exact moment. Suddenly, she understood. Dr. Martinez. The insurance policy Frank mentioned. What if it wasn't just about hiding evidence? What do you mean? What if Thomas set up a dead man's switch? something that would automatically expose the conspiracy if anything happened to his family. Dr. Martinez paused in her packing. That would be incredibly sophisticated for 1943. Thomas was incredibly sophisticated. He invented technology that was decades ahead of its time. Who's to say he couldn't have created a fail-safe system? Before Dr. Martinez could respond, Mayor Fletcher's voice echoed from the front hall. "Time's up, Ms. Sullivan." As they led her to the police car, Irene caught sight of Frank's truck approaching from the distance. She could only hope he would understand the urgency of their situation and work quickly to uncover whatever additional evidence. Thomas had hidden the county mental health facility was a grim institutional building that felt designed to break spirits rather than heal minds. Dr. Harrison turned out to be a thin, nervous man who seemed more interested in his clipboard than in Irene's actual mental state. "Tell me about these delusions regarding the Whitmore mansion." He began without preamble. "They're not delusions. I have documented evidence of a conspiracy spanning 80 years. Evidence that you claim to have found in a secret room that no one else can verify." Irene realized the trap they'd set for her. Anything she said about the hidden room, the stolen patents, or the Power Alliance would sound like the paranoid fantasies of an unstable mind, especially without the physical evidence to support her claims. "Dr. Harrison, have you examined the actual documents I'm referring to?" "I don't need to examine documents to recognize delusional thinking. Ms. Sullivan, the idea that major corporations would murder people over electrical patents is clearly a paranoid fantasy brought on by the stress of your pregnancy and recent divorce. But what if I could prove? What I need you to do is focus on reality. You're a single mother with limited resources who bought a house you can't afford to maintain. It's understandable that you might create elaborate fantasies to avoid dealing with these difficult circumstances." The interview continued for 2 hours, with Dr. Harrison skillfully reframing every piece of evidence as a symptom of mental illness. By the end, Irene understood that her evaluation had been predetermined. She would be declared unstable regardless of what she said. But what Dr. Harrison didn't know was that help was already on the way. Dr. Martinez's brother had moved quickly upon receiving word of Irene's situation. By evening, federal agents were knocking on the mental health facility's doors with warrants for the evidence that had been discovered at the Whitmore mansion. "I'm Agent Sarah Collins with the FBI's Public Corruption Unit, the lead investigator," announced to Dr. Harrison. "We need to speak with Irene Sullivan immediately. Miss Sullivan is undergoing psychiatric evaluation. She's not available for questioning. She's not being questioned, Doctor. She's being placed in federal protective custody as a material witness in an ongoing investigation into corporate conspiracy and murder." The legal maneuvering that followed was swift and decisive. Federal jurisdiction trumped local authority, and within hours, Irene found herself in a safe house with Agent Collins and a team of federal prosecutors who seemed genuinely shocked by the scope of the evidence Frank and Dr. Martinez had compiled. "Ms. Sullivan," Agent Collins said, spreading out photographs and documents on the safe house kitchen table, "what you've uncovered isn't just a historical conspiracy. The Power Alliance is currently active, and we have evidence they've been planning to eliminate you just as they eliminated your great-grandfather." "What kind of evidence?" "Intercepted communications, financial transfers, even surveillance footage of their operatives at your property. They were planning to stage another accident within the next 48 hours. The baby kicked hard at those words, as if responding to the danger that had been so close. Irene placed her hands on her belly, overwhelmed by how quickly her world had changed. "Agent Collins, what happens now?" "Now we finish what your great-grandfather started. The evidence you've provided, combined with what we've been able to gather through federal surveillance, is enough to bring down the entire Power Alliance. We're talking about RICO charges, conspiracy to commit murder, decades of criminal activity, and Thomas's patents will be restored to their rightful owner, you. Based on our preliminary analysis, You're looking at approximately $200 million in back royalties, plus ongoing licensing fees that could reach tens of millions annually. Irene felt tears coming, not from joy at the money, but from relief that justice was finally within reach. Thomas Whitmore's killers would face consequences. His revolutionary work would see the light of day, and future inventors would be protected from the kind of suppression that had cost her family so dearly. "There's one more thing," Agent Collins said gently. "We found something else at your property today. Something your great-grandfather left specifically for his descendants." She handed Irene a sealed envelope, aged but perfectly preserved. Written on the front in Thomas's familiar handwriting were the words, "For the Whitmore who comes home." Inside was a letter dated April 14th, 1943, the day before Thomas and his family left for their final trip to Pittsburgh. "My dear descendant," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then the forces I have spent years fighting have finally been defeated. The work I could not complete in my lifetime has been finished by someone who shares my blood and my determination to see justice done." As Irene read her great-grandfather's final words, she realized that everything, her divorce, her desperate arrival at the mansion, even her pregnancy, had been part of a larger design that Thomas Whitmore had set in motion 80 years ago. The last Whitmore had indeed come home, and she had brought justice with her. The federal safe house felt like a command center for a war that had been fought in shadows for 8 decades. Agent Collins and her team worked around the clock, coordinating with prosecutors across multiple jurisdictions to build an airtight case against the Power Alliance. Irene found herself at the center of a legal storm that was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her pregnancy had progressed to 35 weeks, and the stress of recent events had triggered occasional contractions that Dr. Martinez monitored with growing concern. "You need to stay calm," Dr. Martinez warned during her daily checkup. "The baby could come early if these stress levels continue." "I'll be calm when the people who murdered my family are behind bars," Irene replied, studying surveillance photographs of Power Alliance operatives who had been watching her property. Agent Collins looked up from her laptop, where she'd been coordinating with federal prosecutors. "That might happen sooner than you think. We've secured indictments against 12 individuals, including James Fletcher and 3 current CEOs of major electrical companies." "What about the government officials involved?" "That's where things get complicated. Some of the original conspirators are dead, others are protected by statutes of limitations. But we found evidence of ongoing corruption that should be enough to clean house in several agencies." Frank arrived that afternoon with news that changed everything. Working with federal technicians, he'd located and excavated the final evidence cache that Thomas Whitmore had buried on the property. "You're not going to believe what we found," he said, setting a metal box on the safe house table. "Your great-grandfather wasn't just hiding evidence, he was building a case." Inside the box was a complete dossier on every individual involved in the conspiracy against him. Photographs, financial records, personal correspondence, even recorded conversations that Thomas had somehow obtained using primitive recording equipment. "How did he manage this?" Agent Collins asked, examining the sophisticated surveillance materials. "Thomas was an electrical engineer," Irene reminded them. "He invented recording devices decades before they became commercially available. He knew exactly what was coming and documented everything. But the most remarkable discovery was a series of technical drawings that showed Thomas's power grid technology in its complete, refined form. The designs were far more advanced than anything they'd found previously, incorporating innovations that were still cutting-edge by modern standards. If this technology were implemented today, Agent Collins said, consulting with federal engineers, it would revolutionize electrical distribution worldwide. We're talking about reducing power transmission losses by 90% while increasing grid reliability exponentially, which explains why the Power Alliance was so desperate to suppress it, Frank observed. This isn't just about money, it's about preventing a fundamental transformation of how energy works. Dr. Martinez had been quietly studying the medical reports in the file. Irene, there's something else. Thomas documented health problems that several Power Alliance executives were experiencing in 1943. Based on his notes, they were using experimental electrical treatments, essentially early versions of electroshock therapy, to eliminate perceived threats. They were torturing people. Worse, they were using Thomas's own research into electrical applications to develop methods of murder that would look like accidents or natural deaths, the scope of the power. Alliance's crimes continued to expand with each new piece of evidence. They hadn't just stolen patents and killed inventors. They'd weaponized Thomas's humanitarian research to create an industrial killing machine that had operated for 8 decades. Agent Collins, Irene said, studying the timeline of murders and disappearances. How many people do you estimate they've killed over the years? Based on what we've uncovered so far, at least 40 inventors and researchers, probably more. The pattern goes back to the 1940s and continues to the present day. That evening, as Irene lay in the safe house bedroom, feeling the baby's increasingly active movements, she reflected on the magnitude of what they'd uncovered. Her great-grandfather hadn't just been a brilliant inventor. He'd been a one-man resistance, movement against forces that threatened the very foundation of technological progress. The next morning brought news that sent shockwaves. Through the federal investigation, James Fletcher had been found dead in his hotel room, apparently from a heart attack. But federal investigators suspected foul play. The Power Alliance is eliminating loose ends, Agent Collins explained grimly. Fletcher knew too much about current operations. His death sends a message to other conspirators: cooperate with us and die. Does this change anything for our case? It makes it more urgent. We need to move fast before they can eliminate more witnesses or destroy additional evidence. Dr. Martinez arrived with concerns that went beyond legal strategy. Irene, your blood pressure is elevated and the contractions are becoming more regular. I'm worried about preterm labor. How much more time do we have? Medically, you should be on bed rest immediately. Realistically, the baby could come any day. Agent Collins overheard the conversation and made a decision that would define the next phase of their operation. We're moving up the timeline. Grand jury hearings start tomorrow, and we're going public with the charges immediately after. What does that mean for me? It means you'll be testifying while 8 months pregnant, and we'll need to have medical facilities standing by in case you go into labor during the proceedings. That night, Irene called Mrs. Chen for the first time since entering protective custody. The elderly woman's voice carried both relief and worry. Child, the whole town is talking about what you've uncovered. Some people are frightened, others are angry, but most are proud that someone finally had the courage to seek justice. Mrs. Chen, I need to ask you something. Did your grandfather ever tell you about other people who were involved? People in town who might have helped Thomas? He mentioned a few names, people who were sympathetic but too afraid to speak up. But there was one person he always said was completely trustworthy. Who? The librarian Margaret Whitmore, Thomas's wife. My grandfather said she kept her own records, her own evidence. If any of her materials survived, Irene felt the baby kick hard, as if responding to this new revelation. Mrs. Chen, where would Margaret have hidden her evidence? The library, of course. Where else would a librarian keep her most precious documents? Agent Collins, who had been listening to the conversation, immediately dispatched a team to search the Millbrook Public Library. What they found there would provide the final pieces needed to destroy the Power Alliance completely. Hidden in the library's basement, sealed in waterproof containers, were Margaret Whitmore's personal files, including correspondence with other inventors' wives who had formed an underground network to document the conspiracy against their husbands. The women had known. They had prepared, and they had left behind evidence that would finally bring their killers to justice. As Irene felt another contraction building, Stronger than the ones before, she realized that tomorrow's grand jury hearing would determine not just her own future, but the future of every inventor who had ever dared to challenge established power. The battle Thomas Whitmore had started 8 decades ago was about to reach its conclusion, and his great-granddaughter would be there to see justice finally served. The federal courthouse in Philadelphia buzzed with an energy that Irene had never experienced. Media trucks lined the streets, their satellite dishes reaching toward gray December skies like mechanical flowers. Inside, prosecutors moved with the focused intensity of people who knew they were making history. Irene sat in the witness waiting room, 8.5 months pregnant, wearing the same dress she'd worn to sign the deed for the Whitmore mansion 3 months earlier. Dr. Martinez checked her blood pressure for the 3rd time that morning. Still elevated, but stable, she reported to Agent Collins. "We need to get her testimony completed quickly. The grand jury is ready," Agent Collins confirmed. Irene, remember, just tell the truth. Let the evidence speak for itself. Through the courthouse windows, Irene could see protesters gathering. Some carried signs supporting corporate accountability. Others demanded protection for inventors and entrepreneurs. A few displayed photographs of Thomas Whitmore and the other victims of the Power Alliance conspiracy. "Miss Sullivan?" A court clerk appeared in the doorway. "The grand jury is ready for your testimony." The grand jury room was smaller than Irene had expected, filled with 23 citizens who would determine whether the evidence warranted criminal charges against the most powerful electrical conspiracy in American history. As she settled into the witness chair, another contraction gripped her, stronger and more regular than before. "Miss Sullivan," the prosecutor began, "that please state your relationship to Thomas Whitmore. He was my great-grandfather. I'm the last surviving member of his family line. And how did you come to possess evidence of the conspiracy against him?" Irene took a deep breath and began to tell the story that had started with a desperate pregnant woman seeking shelter and evolved into the exposure of 8 decades of murder and corruption. She described finding the hidden room, discovering Thomas's journal, uncovering the network of evidence caches he'd created as insurance against his own death. The Power Alliance killed my great-grandfather, not just for his inventions, but because his technology threatened their control over the entire electrical industry, she explained. They've been killing inventors ever since, suppressing innovations that could benefit humanity in order to protect their profits. The grand jurors listened with expressions of growing amazement and outrage. Several took notes as Irene described the sophisticated surveillance and documentation systems Thomas had created. The evidence of government complicity, the ongoing murders disguised as accidents. "Ms. Sullivan," one grand juror asked, "do you have proof that these crimes are continuing today?" "Yes. Federal agents intercepted communications showing that the Power Alliance was planning to kill me, just as they killed my great-grandfather. The only difference is that this time someone was watching." As she spoke, Irene felt another contraction building. She gripped the witness chair, trying to maintain her composure while her body prepared for labor. Dr. Martinez, who had been allowed to remain in the room due to Irene's condition, moved closer with obvious concern. "Are you all right to continue?" the prosecutor asked. "I'm fine," Irene insisted, though sweat had broken out on her forehead. "This is too important to stop now," she continued her testimony, describing the moment she'd realized the significance of what she'd found. The federal investigation that had followed, the evidence that proved the Power Alliance had murdered dozens of inventors over 8 decades. They didn't just steal patents, she emphasized. They stole the future. How many revolutionary technologies have been suppressed? How many innovations that could have solved energy crises, reduced pollution, or improved life for millions of people never saw the light of day because they threatened corporate profits? The prosecutor introduced the physical evidence, Thomas's journal, the corporate correspondence, the financial records showing payments for murders, the surveillance files documenting ongoing criminal activity. Piece by piece, they built a case that was overwhelming in its scope and devastating in its implications. "Ladies and gentlemen of the grand jury," the prosecutor concluded. What we have before us is evidence of the longest-running criminal conspiracy in American industrial history. The Power Alliance has murdered, stolen, and corrupted their way to controlling technologies that rightfully belong to the American people. As the prosecutor spoke, Irene felt the most intense contraction yet. This one was different, deeper, more purposeful. She caught Dr. Martinez's eye and saw her own realization reflected there. "I think," Irene whispered. "The baby is coming." Dr. Martinez immediately moved to her side, checking her pulse and timing the contractions. "How long have you been feeling this pattern?" "About 20 minutes, but they're getting stronger." The prosecutor had finished his presentation and was asking the grand jury to vote on the indictments. Irene tried to focus on the proceedings, but her body had other priorities. Another contraction hit, this one strong enough to make her gasp. "We need to get her to a hospital," Dr. Martinez announced quietly to Agent Collins. "Can we wait until the vote?" Irene asked through gritted teeth. "I don't think we have a choice in the matter." The grand jury foreman stood to announce their decision. "On the charges of conspiracy to commit murder, we vote to indict. On the charges of patent fraud and theft, we vote to indict. On the charges of ongoing criminal enterprise, we vote to indict." Each yes vote felt like vindication for Thomas Whitmore and every other victim of the Power Alliance. But as the final vote was announced, Irene felt her water break. "Hospital," Dr. Martinez said firmly. Now, as federal agents rushed to escort her from the courthouse, Irene realized that her great-grandfather's great-granddaughter was about to be born on the same day that justice was finally served for his murder. Some coincidences, she thought as another contraction hit, were too perfect to be accidental. The hospital delivery room had been secured by federal agents, but Irene barely noticed the extra security as labor intensified. Dr. Martinez worked alongside the hospital's obstetric team while Agent Collins monitored updates from the courthouse on her secure phone. "The indictments are public," Agent Collins reported between Irene's contractions. 12 defendants, including 3 Fortune 500 CEOs. "The stock market is already reacting. Power company stocks are down 15% across the board." "Good," Irene gasped as another contraction peaked. About time the market reflected reality. The baby seemed determined to arrive quickly, as if eager to enter a world where justice was finally being served. Between contractions, Irene could hear news broadcasts from the waiting room television reporting on what journalists were already calling the scandal of the century. "Ms. Sullivan," Dr. Martinez said, checking her progress, "you're almost ready to push. This baby is definitely ready to meet the world." As labor reached its final stage, Agent Collins received a call that changed everything. "Irene, you need to hear this. 3 more Power Alliance executives have been arrested, and their computers contained files showing they were planning to eliminate additional witnesses, including Mrs. Chen and Frank." The thought of her friends in danger gave Irene a surge of strength that matched her body's natural rhythms. "Are they safe?" "They're in protective custody now, but this proves the conspiracy was even more active than we thought." Dr. Martinez guided Irene through the final pushes, and at 4:47 p.m., on December 15th, exactly 1 month before Thomas Whitmore's birthday, Emma Margaret Sullivan entered the world with a cry that seemed to echo through the secured hospital wing. "She's perfect," Dr. Martinez announced, placing the baby on Irene's chest. 8 pounds, 2 ounces, and clearly her mother's daughter. Emma had Thomas Whitmore's strong chin and intelligent eyes, but her father's dark hair and her mother's determined expression. As Irene held her daughter for the first time, she felt the weight of 8 decades of injustice finally lifting from her shoulders. "Emma Margaret," she whispered, "named for your great-great-grandfather's wife, who helped preserve the evidence that brought justice for our family." Agent Collins approached the bed with news that seemed almost anticlimactic after the miracle of birth. "The Power Alliance has agreed to a complete settlement. Patent restoration, full compensation for suppressed technologies, and cooperation with ongoing investigations." "How much are we talking about?" The financial analysts are still calculating, but preliminary estimates suggest over 200 million in back royalties, plus ongoing licensing fees that could reach 50 million annually. You're going to be one of the wealthiest women in Pennsylvania. Irene looked down at Emma, who had settled into peaceful sleep against her chest. The money's important, but it's not why we did this, I know. But it means you'll have the resources to ensure this never happens again. You can fund research, protect inventors, make sure future innovations reach the public instead of being suppressed. Frank and Mrs. Chen arrived that evening, both beaming with pride and relief. The elderly woman took Emma in her arms with the practiced ease of someone who had helped raise generations of children. "She has the Whitmore look," Mrs. Chen observed. "Strong and stubborn, just like her great-great-grandfather." Frank handed Irene a manila envelope. This came today from the patent office. Official restoration of Thomas Whitmore's patents to his rightful heir, you. The documents were impressive in their scope and technical detail, but what moved Irene most was the letter that accompanied them from the patent office director. It read, in part, "The theft of Thomas Whitmore's innovations represents one of the darkest chapters in American patent history. The restoration of these patents to his descendant serves not only justice, but as a reminder that innovation and integrity will ultimately triumph over corruption and greed." Dr. Martinez performed a final examination before releasing Irene and Emma from the hospital. "Both of you are healthy and strong. But Irene, you need to take time to recover. The stress of recent months was enormous. Your body needs rest. I will. But first, I want to take Emma home. To the Whitmore mansion." Agent Collins looked concerned. "Are you sure that's safe?" "We could arrange for continued protection. The power alliance is finished," Irene said with quiet confidence. "Their leaders are in custody, their conspiracy exposed, their control broken. The mansion isn't a target anymore. It's a symbol of what happens when justice finally prevails." That night, as federal agents provided escort back to Millbrook, Irene sat in the back seat holding Emma and watching the familiar landscape roll past. The trees were bare now, their branches reaching toward a clear winter sky filled with stars that seemed brighter than she remembered. When they reached the Whitmore estate, the mansion's windows glowed with warm light that Frank had arranged to welcome them home. Mrs. Chen had prepared the library, with a crib and everything Emma would need for her first night in the house where her great-great-grandfather had dreamed of changing the world. As Irene settled, Emma in the crib beside Thomas Whitmore's portrait, she whispered the words she'd been saving for this moment. "We're home, great-grandfather. Justice is served, your work will live on, and the Whitmore family has finally come home to stay." 6 months later, the Whitmore estate had been transformed from a crumbling relic into a beacon of hope and innovation. The mansion's Victorian grandeur had been lovingly restored, but with modern touches that honored both past and future. Solar panels gleamed discreetly on the carriage house roof, while Thomas's original electrical grid design had been updated and implemented to make the property completely energy independent. Irene stood in the library, now serving as both her office and Emma's playroom, watching her 6-month-old daughter reach for the mobile that hung above her crib. The mobile was Frank's creation, tiny replicas of Thomas's inventions, spinning gently in the afternoon breeze from the open windows. The portrait of Thomas Whitmore still watched over the room, but it was no longer alone. Beside it hung a photograph of Emma's first portrait, taken the day they returned from the hospital. The image captured Irene, holding her daughter in the same chair where Thomas had once worked on his revolutionary designs, creating a visual bridge between past and future that visitors often found deeply moving. "The documentary crew should be here within the hour," Mrs. Chen announced, entering with her usual efficient grace. At 85, she had become the unofficial historian of the Whitmore story, working with filmmakers and journalists to ensure the truth of what had happened would never be forgotten or distorted. "Are you ready for this?" Irene asked, adjusting Emma's blanket. The baby had become remarkably adaptable to the steady stream of visitors, reporters, inventors, students, and curiosity seekers who came to see the mansion where one of the most significant corporate conspiracies in American history had finally been exposed. "Child, I've been ready to tell this story for 80 years, Mrs. Chen replied with a smile. It's gratifying to finally have people who want to listen. The documentary was just one of many projects that had emerged from the exposure of the Power Alliance conspiracy. 3 books were in development, including one by Dr. Martinez's brother that would examine the legal precedents established by the case. Universities had established research grants in Thomas Whitmore's name, specifically focused on protecting inventors and ensuring their innovations reached the public. Frank appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a work rag. "The new workshop is ready for the tour," he announced. "Got the replica of Thomas's original. Equipment set up just like he would have had it. The workshop had been Frank's passion project, a recreation of Thomas's laboratory based on detailed descriptions from his journal and photographs found in Margaret Whitmore's files. It served both as a museum exhibit and a functional research space where visiting inventors could work on projects that might have been suppressed under the old system. "Any word from Dr. Martinez?" Irene asked. "She's running late from the clinic, but she'll be here before the cameras roll," Frank assured her. "Said to tell you she has news about the medical research grants. Dr. Martinez had used her portion of the reward money from the federal investigation to establish free clinics in rural areas, ensuring that no one would face the kind of healthcare uncertainty that Irene had experienced during her pregnancy. Her work had become a model for community-supported medicine that was being replicated across the country. The sound of vehicles approaching drew their attention to the windows. The documentary crew was arriving, along with a small group of visitors that had become routine at the Whitmore estate. Inventors, entrepreneurs, and innovators who came seeking inspiration or advice from the woman who had taken on the most powerful corporate conspiracy in American history, and won. As they prepared to receive their guests, Irene reflected on how dramatically her life had changed since that desperate October morning when she'd signed the deed to a house everyone else was afraid to touch. The financial settlement had indeed made her wealthy beyond imagination, but the money had never been the point. What mattered was that Thomas Whitmore's revolutionary work was finally being implemented, that future inventors would be protected from the kind of suppression her family had endured, and that Emma would grow up in a world where innovation was celebrated rather than feared. The Power Alliance trials had concluded 3 months earlier with convictions across the board. Several executives received life sentences for conspiracy to commit murder, while others faced decades in prison for their roles in the conspiracy. The financial penalties had been so severe that 2 major electrical companies had been forced into bankruptcy, their assets redistributed to competitors who agreed to implement more ethical business practices. Perhaps most importantly, the case had led to fundamental reforms in patent law and corporate oversight. The Whitmore Protocols now protected inventors and whistleblowers, while new federal agencies monitored corporate suppression of innovations that could benefit the public. "Miss Sullivan?" The documentary director approached as his crew set up equipment in the library. "We're ready whenever you are." Irene picked up Emma, who gurgled happily at the attention, and settled into the chair beside Thomas's portrait. This interview would be different from the dozens she'd given over the past months. This one would be preserved for history, a record of how justice had finally been served after 8 decades of injustice. "Before we begin," she said to the director, "I want to make sure we emphasize that this isn't really my story. It's Thomas Whitmore's story, and Margaret's story, and the story of every inventor who was silenced by corporate greed. I was just fortunate enough to be the one who finally had the resources and support to finish what they started." As the cameras began rolling, Irene found herself thinking about the letter Thomas had left for the descendant who would one day come home. He had written about his hope that justice would eventually prevail, that his work would someday benefit humanity as he had intended. Looking around the restored library, at the workshop where young inventors now worked on projects that would have been suppressed under the old system, at the thriving community that had grown up around the mansion, Irene knew that Thomas's hopes had been more than fulfilled. The most important thing people need to understand, she told the camera, is that innovation belongs to everyone. When corporations suppress technologies that could benefit humanity, they're not just stealing from inventors, they're stealing from the future itself. Emma reached toward the camera with chubby fingers, as if she understood that this moment was being preserved for her to watch someday when she was old enough to understand her family's legacy. The baby's eyes held the same intelligent curiosity that gazed down from Thomas Whitmore's portrait, promising that the tradition of innovation and integrity would continue for another generation. As the afternoon sun slanted through the library windows, casting warm light over the scene, Irene felt a deep sense of completion. The mansion that had once symbolized abandonment and decay now represented renewal and hope. The family that had been destroyed by greed and corruption had been restored through courage and persistence. Thomas Whitmore's greatest invention, she realized, hadn't been his revolutionary electrical grid. It had been the network of evidence and safeguards he'd created to ensure that someday, somehow, justice would find its way home. And it had. After 80 years of waiting, justice had finally come home to the Whitmore estate, carried in the hands of a desperate pregnant woman who had been brave enough to see possibility where others saw only ruin. The story was complete, but the legacy would continue forever.